Hey, Laura Rice here. We're trying to improve the Texas Standard podcast experience, and we want to know what you think. If you have a minute, could you please fill out our podcast survey at texasstandard.org/survey? You can also find a link in the description. And thanks.
A political season in Texas like few others in recent memory. After a legislative session and 4 special sessions, where do we stand? More today on The Standard.
Texas Standard is a production of KUT Austin, KERA North Texas, Houston Public Media, and Texas Public Radio in San Antonio. I'm
David Brown. We'll have an update on special session number 4 and what events of the past few days add up to for education in the Lone Star State. Also, November 22nd, 1963. It was on this date 60 years ago. A sunny Friday in Dallas turned into one of the darkest days in the history of the United States. We'll hear firsthand accounts from 2 who were there in the presidential motorcade when shots rang out in Dealey Plaza and the world held its breath. Reflections on one day in Dallas and a whole lot more when the Texas Standard gets underway right after this. No matter where you are, it's Texas Standard Time on this day before Thanksgiving 2023. This November 22nd is a date that resonates deeply in Texas and in national history. We're devoting the second half of our program today to the events of November 22nd, 1963, 60 years ago today, and the first-hand accounts of 2 who were in President John Kennedy's motorcade on that fateful day in Dallas. That's after the news roundup in a little more than 20 minutes or so. But we begin today's broadcast with where we stand after what has been an historic year for the Texas Legislature. First, of course, there was the regular legislative session. Then came multiple special sessions, culminating in special session number 4. Now still technically underway at the Texas Capitol, though lawmakers have taken a break for Thanksgiving. Still, it's a marquee proposal pushed hard by Governor Abbott that's drawn a lot of attention of late. And late last week, the Texas House of Representatives finally voted on it, a wide-ranging education bill that included education savings accounts, or ESAs. However, before passing the legislation, a majority of House members voted to strip out those ESAs, the voucher-like program that would have allowed parents to use tax dollars to send their children to private and religious schools. I said marquee proposal. In fact, by many measures, passing education savings accounts was Governor Greg Abbott's top legislative priority of the year, leading up to his call for 4 special sessions so far in an effort to win passage. Here to tell us more about where things stand at the moment, Sergio Martínez-Beltrán, who covers the Capitol for the Texas Newsroom. Sergio, welcome back.
Hi, David.
And we're also joined by Julián Aguilar, who covers breaking news and the border for the Texas Newsroom. Julián, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me back on.
Sergio, let's start with you. This marks the first time, as I understand it, in the legislature's 176-year history. Lawmakers have met for more than 3 special sessions in the same year as a regular session. Wow. How do you describe the mood of lawmakers at the Capitol these days?
Chaotic. It's been a little messy, but truly there's a lot of frustrations from both sides. We have a group of Republicans who are frustrated because the priorities of the governor in terms of education, like education savings accounts, have not passed despite this being the 4th special session. So there's frustrations between them because there's other Republicans, right, who have opposed school vouchers historically, and they did it last week as well, and the priorities of the governor are, have not been passed because of that. There's also some frustration from members because, remember, this is a part-time legislature. They're not supposed to be in Austin in October. They were supposed to go back to their districts in June or May, right? And still here they are. So there's a lot of frustrations from them because they haven't been able to go back to their districts and spend time with their families. And here we are a day before Thanksgiving, and lawmakers were in Austin yesterday having to vote.
Yeah. So where do things stand on that education savings account plan that the governor has been trying to get passed?
So like you mentioned, the House try to vote on HB1, which was this education omnibus bill that included education savings accounts, this voucher-like program, but also included funding to increase the basic allotment, which is the per pupil funding, and also to do some reforms in the education system. But a coalition of rural Republicans and Democrats voted to take out that school voucher provision. And what happened was that the author of the bill, Chairman Brad Buckley, he decided to send back the bill to committee. So the House didn't fully vote on the measure. Instead, the House is going back to committee, and it's our understanding that Chairman Buckley is not planning on having any more discussions on HB1. So HB1 is presumed dead. Now, the Senate had sent their version of a school voucher bill, which is only a bill that targets school vouchers, but that's not likely to move forward in the House either.
Wait a minute. Didn't the governor say, unless you pass this, lawmakers, unless you pass these education savings accounts, not only am I not going to sign it, I'm going to keep bringing you back to Austin until you do?
That's exactly what the governor said, but that was not a strong enough threat, it seems like, right? It seems like rural Republicans were able to hold their ground for the most part, and Democrats also did the same thing. And it seems like truly these folks who oppose school vouchers are not blinking and are not going to, shift in their position on this issue.
And we should point out that one of the reasons that Republicans representing rural jurisdictions seem to be opposed to this is because they feel like this will undermine public schools, and there just aren't as many private school options in many rural parts of Texas, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in these rural communities, school districts tend to be the largest employers. So there's also this concern that redirecting public dollars into private schools could affect the largest employer in their district. But that part that you mentioned, David, is super important. In many of these school districts in rural areas, there's now private schools. So truly, a lot of these rural Republicans feel that a school voucher plan is not going to benefit any of the students in their district.
Well, Julián Aguilar of the Texas Newsroom, I want to bring you in here because it's not just education that's been a focus in this special session, number 4. Border security has also been on the agenda, and I seem to recall lawmakers did pass something on that front that's getting a lot of attention, not just in Texas, but nationally, right?
That's correct, yes. So during this current special session, the 4th, as you mentioned, they passed Senate Bill 4, which has been dubbed the illegal entry bill, which would basically allow local and state law enforcement to arrest a person and charge them with illegal entry into Texas, and then take them to a magistrate or a state judge where that official would have the power to order them to return to Mexico. It's a statewide bill, which means that the police officer doesn't necessarily have to see a person attempting to enter Texas between the ports of entry. And, folks are teeing up lawsuits probably as we speak right now, because there are a lot of questions about the constitutionality, about whether this is going to, promote racial profiling, and whether this is necessary, because all these enforcement mechanisms the state of Texas has put into place over the last 2 years don't seem to be slowing down the flow of unauthorized migration into the state.
I think that what a lot of people have been pointing out is that, at least historically, border security has been a federal function, and there's this doctrine of preemption that leaves those domains of federal law enforcement to the feds exclusively. Is that sort of the crux of all these lawsuit threats over Senate Bill 4?
Yeah, those are the main arguments against it. I mean, obviously there are concerns, like I said, about racial profiling and,
right,
and targeting vulnerable communities. But I think the thing that the opponents are going to hang their hat on is the fact that immigration enforcement is largely under the purview of the federal government, and I say largely because folks have pointed to a previous case that came out of an Arizona state law, SB 1070, where the high court ruled, again, that the federal government has the purview. Although in that case, they did say, well, you can't prevent state and local law enforcement from inquiring into the immigration status of a person. But my understanding from speaking to immigration attorneys and folks that plan to challenge this legislation, they say that more broadly, the way Texas's SB 4 statute is written, specifically because of the state deportation provision, that is what makes it unconstitutional. Yes, states can craft certain bills to a certain limit, but when you're talking about returning somebody to a foreign country, which obviously involves coordination between federal governments from the United States and other countries, that's where they draw the line, because this is obviously a federal issue and not a state issue. So that's, I think, going to be the main argument once this bill is signed into law and these court challenges move forward.
Julián, has this bill made it to the governor's desk yet? Is he any word on where it stands? I presume he intends to sign this?
He said he's going to sign it. I wouldn't want to predict when it's going to happen. There have been certain bills that have been very controversial that, he has an announcement, he wants the press there, and he has the Republican supporters of this, standing behind him for a photo opportunity. He gives out the ceremonial pens to the sponsors and the authors of the bill. This could happen, maybe next week, or he could just sign it quietly, and, the wonks and the journalists that have been covering this won't know until they check the Texas Legislature site, and they'll be like, oh, okay, well, he signed it. So it's really up in the air with everything, with sort of the loss that the Republican Party took on vouchers, with the holidays coming up. I hate to predict what any lawmaker, specifically, especially the governor, is going to do on a bill signing. But yeah, he could sign these whenever he'd like to. One thing that is lingering, though, is Senate Bill 3, which is also controversial, which would provide $1.5 billion for border infrastructure and border barriers. That needs to clear one more hurdle in the Senate, and the House and the Senate are taking the rest of the week off, and they won't be back until after the holidays. So there's still more to tune into with respect to border security legislation this session.
Sergio, any other issues the legislature is expected to take up before they gavel out of the fourth?
So the House did pass House Bill 2, which created school safety grant programs. It also allows for the money allocated for this program to also be used to run a fentanyl awareness program or initiative. Mm-hmm. And that bill was passed by the House. It's now awaiting its fate in the Texas Senate. Again, the Senate is not coming back until next week, so we'll see if they'll pick it up then.
And it's not over for the fourth just yet. Lawmakers expected to return after the holiday break. We've been talking with Julián Aguilar with the Texas Newsroom and Sergio Martínez-Beltrán, who covers politics for the Newsroom at the Capitol. Sergio, Julián, thanks so much, and happy Thanksgiving to you both.
You're welcome. Happy holiday.
Thanks again. Have a good week.
And you can keep up with what's happening at the Capitol and all across Texas at our website, texasstandard.org. Hope you'll visit us any old time, 24/7. And by the way, while you're there, make sure you're signed up for the Talk of Texas. That's the weekly newsletter from the Texas Standard team. Hit your mailbox each and every Wednesday morning, and it's free. Stay on top of the news with the Talk of Texas, our weekly newsletter. In just a few more minutes, we've got the Texas News Roundup and a reflection on November 22nd, 1963, as the Standard continues.
Support for Texas Standard comes from Texas Center for Proton Therapy, offering radiation treatment that precisely targets cancer with a focused proton beam just a few millimeters wide. More at texasprotons.com. Support for Texas Standard comes from TCU, striving to address the world's challenges through research, scholarship, and service for 150 years. More at 150.tcu.edu.
Hi, I'm Sarah Postmeyer, Mayor of the City of Cuero, and you are listening to the Texas Standard.
If you talk turkey, turkeys talk back.
The Turkey Fest is now 51 years old, and it's always headlined with the Great Gobbler Gallop, and our football team is also referred to as Gobblers. And it has been a wonderful event to bring these two communities together. And the city of Worthington, Minnesota has experienced a couple of tragedies or natural disasters, and the people of the city of Cuero have responded in certain ways, and the same thing has happened here with the city of Cuero. It started as the Turkey Trot back in 1912, and that was when so many of the farmers would bring their turkeys into town and load them up on the railroad cars, and they'd be shipped north for Thanksgiving. So the Turkey Trot was originally held in early November.
But they are numerous on the broad range around Cuero, Texas, and a community must celebrate what it has. So every year in the crisp fall days before Thanksgiving, Cuero celebrates turkeys.
And we actually have classes on the turkey trot. We have a couple of couples here in town that know how to do it.
Come on, let's turkey trot. Let's get it while it's hot.
Someone wrote a song called the Turkey Trot, but that was quite entertaining back in 1912. The coronation was a large event, and that stayed probably up until the 70s.
And then you would have a parade, which moves along a trifle uncertainly because of the unpredictability of its leading participants. 5,000 turkeys marching down Main Street.
Yeah, it was. We don't have the turkey farms here anymore. Those all probably went to the wayside in the late 60s, middle part of the 70s, and that was another reason why we didn't have the production of the turkeys, so you couldn't walk them down the street anymore. The newspaper editors for the Cuero Record and then the Worthington paper challenged each other to a race with the turkeys from the hometown. So that the town could decide which town was the turkey capital of the world. And Worthington's turkey is named Paycheck because nothing goes faster than a paycheck. And then Cuero's is Ruby Begonia. Those two turkeys race, and we have one heat in Worthington, and the second heat is in Cuero. And then you average the times and see which one has the lowest time, fastest, and they then get the crown. We didn't get it. We lost by a couple of seconds. It was just, I don't know,
The sobering fact is that if there were no Thanksgiving, there might be no turkeys. And if there were no turkeys, there might be no Cuero, Texas. So while we all give thanks on this holiday, Cuero gives most deep and heartfelt thanks. Charles Kuralt, CBS News, on the road in Cuero, Texas.
So that's what we've been doing every year since the middle part of the 70s. So that becomes the Turkey Fest. Hi, I'm Sarah Postmeyer, Mayor of the City of Cuero, and you are listening to the Texas Standard.
Support for Coverage of Business comes from Texas Mutual, a workers' compensation insurance company committed to providing support to nonprofits, bringing positive change to working families and Texas communities. More at texasmutual.com/community.
And you are listening to the Texas Standard. Millions of Texans live in homes governed by a homeowners association, and they may be surprised to find out that their HOA has the power to take their house if they don't keep up with their fees. Christopher Connolly of KERA reports it can even happen to homeowners who don't owe very much money.
Okay, the whole house has been painted and changed the whole floor downstairs.
Finda Karoma has been renovating her house in Mesquite bit by bit for a few years now. Karoma, who grew up in Sierra Leone, bought the house in the hills at Tealwood Development in 2005.
Bathrooms, the commodes, everything has been changed.
Karoma figures she's put tens of thousands of dollars into the upgrades already, every little bit of extra cash she has, because this house is her retirement plan. At least, it was her retirement plan, until she learned that her HOA foreclosed on her, sold her house because she owed them $3,542.64.
I need help because this is a daylight robbery.
Karoma had missed some HOA payments before the pandemic, she says, and then COVID-19 threw her finances into a tailspin. She's a home health nurse, and she lost clients and work. She's been working to get her finances back on track and said she never realized her HOA had asked a court for permission to sell her home so that they could collect on the $3,500 debt. a combination of missed payments as well as late fees, interest, and a lot of extra charges. Zillow estimates Karoma's house is worth about $340,000, and Karoma thinks it could actually sell for more after the renovations. So the idea of losing all of that equity that she's built up just for a few $1,000s of debt feels inconceivable.
I've been here all these years, worked my butt out, and this is what I make. Then all of a sudden, somebody just come overnight and just took everything away from you, just like that.
That's the remedy that the association has available to them.
Jason Reed is an attorney representing the Hills at Tealwood Homeowners Association.
Unfortunately, from time to time, they have to utilize that remedy in order to recover funds that are owed to the association that haven't been paid.
Reed says residents agree to live by the association's rules when they buy a house in an HOA-controlled neighborhood. He says quarterly assessments pay for HOA operations and to maintain shared amenities.
When people don't pay their assessment obligations, the other people in the community are effectively carrying the burden of that person not paying.
It's not clear how often HOAs foreclose on people. Texas doesn't track these kinds of cases. But Nancy Kozanecki from the HOA Reform Coalition says she hears about them all the time.
This is supposed to be a neighborhood thing. This is not meant to go and punish people, but that's what this becomes, is essentially a weapon against the residents in the neighborhood.
Finda Karoma says she learned the HOA took her house in August when she got an eviction notice 8 months after a private company bought it for $82,000 at an auction. The HOA says it's been sending Karoma notices all throughout the foreclosure process. She says she never got them. Now she's challenging the eviction with the help of Legal Aid of Northwest Texas. She's hoping to challenge the foreclosure, too, to get back not just her home, but the financial security she's been working toward for years.
This is my retirement. What else can I do? I don't even know how long I have to live. So when will I retire?
I'm Christopher Connolly in Dallas.
Support for Texas Standard comes from the Texas College Savings Plan, administered by the state of Texas. Families can save for tuition, room and board, books, and other qualified education expenses at eligible schools nationwide. Learn more at texascollegesavings.com.
From the Texas Newsroom, I'm Matt Thomas. Millions of Texans are on the roads today in what is generally the busiest travel day of the year. Doug Shoup with AAA Texas says this afternoon will likely bring the most congestion, with Sunday also very busy.
Drivers can expect extra congestion on Sunday as well, particularly Sunday afternoon, with I-10 East from San Antonio to Houston anticipated to be one of the busiest stretches of roadway in Texas.
An estimated 4 million Texans will be on the road, with airports also seeing an increase in travelers this year. Both chambers of the Texas Legislature gavelled in and out yesterday without taking any action. It's unclear what happens next with the education bill after the education savings account supported by Governor Greg Abbott were voted down. Both chambers will be back in session on Monday. Harris County Judge Lena Hidalgo and 2 other county judges in Texas are asking President Joe Biden to help stop a controversial border bill passed this month in Austin. As Houston Public Media's Andrew Schneider reports, Senate Bill 4 could change enforcement along the border.
In the letter, Hidalgo, El Paso County Judge Ricardo Samaniego, and Travis County Judge Andy Brown asked President Biden to intervene to stop Senate Bill 4, which was passed last week along party lines. It would make unauthorized entry into Texas a state crime and would allow law enforcement to arrest and immediately deport undocumented immigrants. The letter says the new law would violate the U.S. Constitution and is a direct violation of the federal government's jurisdiction over immigration law. The letter goes on to acknowledge the need for immigration reform and a safer border. Governor Abbott says he plans to sign Senate Bill 4 into law soon. I'm Andrew Schneider in Houston.
Authorities in Montgomery County have charged a man with murder over the fentanyl overdose death of a man. Houston Public Media's Erica Smith reports.
Under House Bill 6, signed by Governor Greg Abbott in June, a person can be charged with fentanyl murder if they supply or distribute the drug and it leads to a death. The Smith case is the first time someone has been charged with murder related to fentanyl in Montgomery County. The new law took effect September 1st.
New data from the Texas Demographic Center shows the population in the state grew by 4% from January 2020 to January 2023. Here's Texas Public Radio's Marian Navarro.
The data shows 30.3 million residents currently live in the state. That's up from the 29.1 million residents reported in the 2020 census count. Nearly 68% live in the so-called Texas Triangle, or the 4 major metropolitan areas.
I'm Matt Thomas from the Texas Newsroom.
Support for these Texas headlines comes from Aspire Allergy and Sinus, providing same-day results and custom treatment plans to tackle allergies at the root of the problem. Over 40 locations throughout Texas. More info at aspireallergy.com.
33 minutes past the hour, Texas Standard Time. I'm David Brown. It was on this date 60 years ago that the eyes of the nation and the world turned to Texas. In 2013, the Texas Standard team produced a program marking the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Since that time, some of the voices featured in the story you're about to hear passed away. We'll tell you more about that shortly. But on this 60th anniversary, we're revisiting and sharing with you the story of a day without precedent in Texas, a day that would change the nation and alter the course of history. It was, as we called it then, One Day in Dallas.
It was one of those days when the silver of the jet's fuselage had turned robin's egg blue, reflecting the color of a suddenly cloudless sky. They called it Kennedy weather. The grainy black and white images we've all seen before on television of a smiling president and First Lady disembarking Air Force One at Love Field are in fact misleading. It's as if we almost can't help but glimpse the inevitability and feel helpless. But it's fair to face up to this reality. We've lost the true colors of the moment, the little details that made up that day in Dallas when America transitioned from one era to another. What we do remember, those of us who can remember, is where we were when we heard the news. Sid Davis remembers because he was there, in the motorcade. As the White House bureau chief for the Westinghouse radio stations, Davis had been assigned to accompany the president to cover the Dallas visit.
The bus I was on was press bus number 1. The presidential limousine was about 8 car lengths ahead of the bus.
Also in the motorcade, the press aide for Texas Governor John Connally. His name is Julián Reed.
We had just come down Main Street, part of the motorcade, of course, from Love Field. We had thousands and thousands of people hanging out of skyscrapers to get a glimpse of the president and First Lady. The street was jammed 6 or 7 deep on either side of the limousine. Ms. Connally, she had just turned to the president and said, "Mr. President, you certainly can't say Dallas doesn't love you."
And the crowd at our point is surging forward. There's a big cheer going up as the president gets further down. And now the ticker tape. And here is the President of the United States. And what a crowd, what a tremendous welcome he's getting now. We can, and there's Jackie. She's getting just as big a welcome. And the crowd is absolutely going wild. This is a friendly crowd in downtown Dallas as the President and the First Lady pass by. There is Lyndon Johnson.
Before the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963, neither Sid Davis nor Julián Reed could have expected what they'd be called upon to do, much less that they'd both be eyewitnesses to history. They came from different worlds. Davis was a young radio reporter based in Washington. Reed was on the other side of the journalistic fence, serving as a press aide for the top official in Texas. Governor Connally and his wife were the de facto hosts for the president and the First Lady on that day. As the motorcade wound its way toward the Dallas Trade Mart for a luncheon, the Connollys sat just ahead of the Kennedys in the presidential limousine. Davis and Reed were in the press buses, just a few car lengths back.
There was a kind of an air of light, happy banter because it was such a surprise. There had been so much speculation, a lot of it by the press, of what sort of reaction he would get in Dallas, and it was just the opposite.
Julián Reed.
And then, of course, we made the turn onto Houston Street. And we were about the 8th unit in the motorcade. And about halfway in that block, I had a view directly down on the limousine because they had already made the turn. And I happened to have that view just by sitting where I was in the bus. And all of a sudden, pop, pop, pop.
Most people heard 3 shots.
Sid Davis.
I was sitting next to a friend named Bob Pierpoint of CBS News. Bob had served in Korea. He covered the Korean War, and he was pretty expert on gunfire. And that's the first thing he yelled to all of us. He said, "That's gunfire." Now, there were no Secret Service agents riding on the president's car, as is sometimes normal. Kennedy gave instructions to the Secret Service not to ride on the sides of his car. And his point was, this is how I get elected, and he laughed about it. The crowds started to disperse, and people started running in different directions. And as you approached Dealey Plaza, the so-called grassy knoll, you saw parents jumping on top of their kids to shield them. Women were trying to peel off their shoes or their heels so they could run faster in the grass. By that time, the limousine had just took off, and the follow-up car, which is a great big heavy Cadillac, which follows immediately behind the president's car, took off behind it.
This is an NBC News bulletin. Shots were fired near President Kennedy in Dallas. Here is a report from Robert McNeil, NBC News, with the presidential party in Dallas.
Several shots were fired as President Kennedy's motorcade passed through downtown Dallas. Crowds screamed and lay down on the grass. As the motorcade went by, police broke away and began chasing.
You're listening to One Day in Dallas, a special report by the Texas Standard Team. The story continues in just a moment. Stay with us. You're listening to the Texas Standard. I'm David Brown. On this 60th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, we're listening to the reflections of 2 who were there on that day in Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. Sid Davis, then covering the president's Texas trip for the Westinghouse stations, and Julián Reed, who was that day a press aide to then Texas Governor John Connally. Connally was seated just ahead of Kennedy in the presidential limousine. And like Kennedy, Connally was hit by an assassin's bullet and had been seriously wounded. This is the voice of Julián Reed.
One thing people forget today in telling this story, there were no cell phones. We had no communication. The only ones who had communications were the 3 in the pool car who had, 2 of them had radio phones, I believe, Sid, isn't that right?
One telephone.
One radio telephone. Otherwise, we were out of communications. That seems impossible today, but that was the case. I had to make a decision. I was 1 or 2 on the bus that were kind of making decisions what to do with. I was a host for Governor Connally. That's happened to be on the bus because he was the host, for Texas for that trip. So I had to decide what do we do with this bus, and we thought the best thing to do is go straight on to the Trade Mart, where we knew there were thousands of people waiting for us.
To the Trade Mart. At this time, the announcement has not been made to the several thousand who are here in the Trade Mart as to what has happened. Details are still sketchy. The only thing that we have at this time is the report that the president is at Parkland Hospital, that Governor John Connally was also wounded, and that a Secret Service agent was killed. According to the best reports that we have at this time, there were only 3 shots fired, and apparently all of them struck true.
We went directly to the Trade Mart. They didn't know what had happened. They had no clue. And I jumped out of the bus, literally jumped out of the bus. All the newsmen jumped out and ran to the pay phones that lined the hall. Again, something from that era. Everybody had phones. All these public buildings had rows of pay phones. So all the journalists rushed to the pay phones. And I rushed up to Mr. Eric Johnson, who later became the mayor of Dallas. But he was the dinner chairman, the lunch chairman. And of course, I will never forget going into that room and hearing the murmurs of 3,000 people anticipating the president and first lady to walk in a moment. And they didn't have a clue of what had occurred. So I ran up to him, and he was up on the podium. And I said, Mr. Johnson, we don't know what's happened, but we're afraid that the president and Governor Connally have been shot. He was up above me. He just looked down at me and stared for a moment.
Now, here is an announcement from the podium. Making the announcement will be J. Eric Johnson, the president of the Dallas Citizens Council, one of the sponsoring groups. Here is Mr. Johnson.
It is true that our president, Governor Connally, and the motorcade have been shot. We do not know how seriously.
That was the president of the Dallas Citizens Council. The audience, comprised of many civic and business leaders here, are of course stunned by the announcement that was made a moment ago by Mr. Johnson, confirming.
And then he called for a prayer.
Meanwhile, Sid Davis was still on the press bus, chasing the presidential limousine to Parkland.
We kept pushing the bus driver to chase after the car, which was impossible. No way it would catch the limousine. The bus took us to the Trade Mart, where the speech was still going to take place, and we offloaded that bus in like 5 seconds, charging for telephones through the hall, and there was this press room on the second floor. I got to a phone, talked to my office. I filed a story saying I was in the motorcade, heard the shots, but I couldn't say any more than that. And I got outside, I waved down a car with my Olivetti typewriter, and a wonderful guy stopped with a white Cadillac, and he said, are you a reporter? And I said, yeah. And he said, I'll get you to the hospital. And we took off for the hospital. As I got to the hospital, the presidential limousine was sitting outside the emergency room. And Clint Hill had just, Mrs. Kennedy's agent, had just finished cleaning it up, straightening it out, because there was a mess on the back seat. And I remember seeing Hugh Sidey, a very good friend from Time magazine, standing there. And I went over to take a look inside to see what Clint Hill was working on. And Sidey said, it's too horrible, don't even bother looking. Mrs. Kennedy by then was with the stretcher, and she was helping pull the stretcher inside the emergency room, moving as fast as she could to try to express some urgency to the situation to get him into treatment. And there were a herd of corpsmen around getting him inside. Then I tried to go inside following them, and they threw me out. I went upstairs to the second floor, and I commandeered a phone and a nurse, or a nurse's aide, who held the phone for me while I ran back and forth picking up information, and they held the line open to Washington for me.
But you saw the president's body on the gurney?
I saw a white form on a stretcher. As I got there, I saw the white form on the stretcher had just been raised out of the car, and Mrs. Kennedy was at the head of it, and she was trying to pull it. She was trying to get it inside the hospital. She was desperate to get that stretcher inside the hospital.
Mr. Reed, had you been able to make any sort of contact with Governor Connally or his wife?
Well, when I found her, I ran in the side door of the hospital. I remember vividly how much I was surprised to see nobody at all in sight. The end door of the Parkland Hospital was unattended. I just walked in the end door. And then I went to find a nurse. I found one very quickly and asked her to take me to Miss Connally. She took me to Miss Connally. Miss Connally and Mrs. Kennedy were sitting outside Trauma Room 1 and Trauma Room 2, both their husbands fighting for their lives inside. Someone had placed 2 straight-back chairs in the hallway. Neither of them spoke a word.
White House radio correspondent Sid Davis.
When I went to the second floor of Parkland Hospital, after seeing Mrs. Kennedy take the stretcher inside down below and commandeered a phone, and a lovely nurse's aide held the phone for me. She was wonderful. I regret to this day I never got her name so I could write her a letter and say how wonderful she was. She held the phone open for me. Phones were at a premium. I'm sure you know how tough that was to get the phone. It was chaos in the hospital. I did the best I could with my story, but I was very careful too. As I was on the phone broadcasting what I had seen and waiting for the announcement, anytime now they said we're going to have an announcement from Malcolm Kilduff on the president's condition. I noticed some of my friends were talking to 2 priests about 10 feet from me. And I was on the air live describing everything that I could possibly talk about. And I said to my boss, I just see 2 priests down there talking to Jerry Terhorst of the Detroit News, for instance. I said, I'm going to find out. Hold on, I'll find out what they're saying down there. What do they know? So I ran down there just as this priest said, he's dead all right. I just gave him the last rites. I told Mrs. Kennedy, he said, that I don't believe his soul had left his body. I remember those distinct words. Ran back to my phone, and I talked to this wonderful boss that I had. We were very close friends. He brought me to Washington, and I said, Jim, I want to talk to you, but I don't want to talk to you on the air. And he cut me off the air, and I said, Jim, there's a priest here who says the president's dead. He said he's given him the last rites. What do you want to do? And he said something like, well, what do you want to do? And we both agreed simultaneously that the story was too important. I might have said something like, I know a priest knows what a dead man looks like. But I said, Jim, and he agreed with me. He said, yeah, let's hold it.
From the Texas Standard, One Day in Dallas continues in just a moment.
Support for Texas Standard comes from the Texas ABLE program, a tax advantage savings program helping eligible Texans with disabilities save for the future. Learn more, including how the program works with certain public benefits, at texasable.org.
You're listening to One Day in Dallas, a special report from the Texas Standard team on the assassination of President Kennedy, including reflections from Sid Davis, then a White House correspondent for the Westinghouse stations, covering the president's trip to Texas on November 22, 1963, and Julián Reed, who was serving as press aide to then Texas Governor John Connally. Both Connally and Kennedy had been hit by assassins' bullets. It was the noon hour in Texas, and soon the news out of Dallas was spreading fast. In homes and offices and school classrooms across the nation, radios and TVs were flicked on, and the world seemed to hold its breath.
This is Walter Cronkite in our newsroom, and there has been an attempt, as perhaps you know now, on the life of President Kennedy. He was wounded in an automobile driving from Dallas Airport into downtown Dallas, along with Governor Connally of Texas. They've been taken to Parkland Hospital there, where their condition is as yet unknown. We have not been told their condition. At Dallas, in the downtown hotel room, a group had been gathered to hear President Kennedy when he was waiting his arrival. Let's switch down there now, where Eddie Barker of KRLD is on the air. As you can imagine, there are many stories that are coming in now as to the actual condition of the president. One is that he is dead. This cannot be confirmed. Another is that Governor Connally is in the operating room. This we have not confirmed. The president was whisked from the scene of the attempted assassination, or assassination depending upon his condition, of course, at this hour, by bus to Parkland Hospital. And the president undoubtedly is in the emergency room at that hospital, which would be on the first floor of Parkland. No word is yet. We are awaiting something more official. It is, of course, difficult, certainly, to go on scanty reports. This is Walter Cronkite back at the CBS Newsroom in New York. We have just been advised from Dallas that blood transfusions are being given to President Kennedy.
You know, your heart's pounding, and you don't even want to stop to say in your own mind, Kennedy's dead. So we held the story, and then about a minute or two later, Malcolm Kilduff came walking down the hall. He was assistant press secretary at the time. Came walking by, and he shouted, "There's a nurse's room. We're going to go into a nurse's room." We went in the nurse's training room. He went in there, and he opened up with everybody. His cheeks were streaked with tears. He could barely get the words out of his mouth.
John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today here in Dallas. He died of a gunshot wound in the brain. I have no other details regarding the assassination of the president. Anything about the shooting?
The impact of having the president lost, it was just hard for us to believe that he was dead. Your emotions have to be suppressed.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
I'm Julian Reed, R-E-A-D, aide to Governor Connally.
At Parkland Hospital, Julian Reed relayed the story recounted to him by Governor Connally's wife, a first-hand account of who was where in the presidential limousine when the shots were fired.
The president was seated in the right rear seat. Opposite in the left rear was Mrs. Kennedy. Immediately ahead of the president on a jump seat.
With the world now learning of Kennedy's assassination, a new concern arose, fueled by Cold War fears and the prospect that the U.S. was suddenly vulnerable without a commander-in-chief. White House correspondent Sid Davis says he went looking for Malcolm Kilduff, the young press aide who issued the official announcement of Kennedy's death. Davis says Kilduff was in a secret room at Parkland with the vice president.
Johnson was being held incognito in one of the treatment rooms with Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson was sitting on a stool, and Kilduff, the way he described it to me, many times, he said, I walked in there and I saw Mrs. Johnson sitting down. I looked at Lyndon Johnson, and I always thought Lyndon Johnson as a vice president. I never thought of him as president. And he said, I looked at him and I didn't know what to say, and I said, Mr. President. And he said, Johnson was stunned. Kilduff thinks he was the first one to address Johnson as Mr. President. What do you want me to do? Johnson said, look, Mac, we don't know whether this is a communist conspiracy or not. And Mac says he did mention the word communist. I don't know whether this is a communist conspiracy or not, but you got to give me time to get out of here.
With that, Lyndon Johnson, Lady Bird, Jacqueline Kennedy, and several Kennedy aides were whisked away from Parkland under heavy cover. Reporter Sid Davis was swept up into the entourage en route to Love Field to be the eyes and ears of a nation, one of the few reporters on Air Force One witnessing the official transition of power.
The transfer of power was exemplary on part of Lyndon Johnson in that on Air Force One, his compassion for Mrs. Kennedy, the foresight he had to have his secretary, Marie Famer, in this cabin. We knew that Mrs. Kennedy was in terrible, terrible grief. She had all her wits about her. She knew what was going on. But Lyndon turned to Marie Famer, his secretary. I was standing right beside her, and Lyndon said, would you please go ask Mrs. Kennedy if she would like to stand with us for the swearing in? There's going to be a picture taken. Lyndon Johnson knew the meaning of pictures. And Marie went back and talked to Mrs. Kennedy, and I thought to myself at that instant, you know, that would really be something if she leaves the casket, because she stayed with the casket all the way out from the hospital. She wouldn't leave it. The patriotism that she showed in coming up there to show there was unity in this country. Her husband was shot to death, and she was there with the new president. And I think the genius of Lyndon Johnson was to show this picture of the transitional role in America. The Constitution still lives. The Constitution works. And it showed the world that the United States was not imperiled here. And that picture tells millions of words about who we are as a people.
The voice of Sid Davis, who would continue to serve as a Washington, D.C. reporter for many years. He still writes and lectures on his experiences as a journalist. Julian Reed would launch his own public relations firm and serve as counselor to several presidents. He died in 2021 at age 93. We spoke with Davis and Reed back in 2013 on the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. There's more on that historic day in Dallas at texasstandard.org. We'll be back on the air tomorrow. On behalf of the Texas Standard team, I'm David Brown, wishing you and yours a very happy Thanksgiving.
Philanthropic support for Texas Standard comes from Casey and Scott O'Hare, the Winkler Family Foundation, Lynn Dobson and Greg Woldridge, Adrian Killam, the George Huntington family, and St. David's Foundation. Additionally, Texas Mutual Insurance Company is a founding sponsor of Texas Standard.
If you want to know what's going on in the world, then you need to know what's going on in Texas. Every weekday on the Texas Standard, we bring you stories from across the state that affect what's going on elsewhere. As part of the NPR network, an independent coalition of public media podcasters, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Michael Marks. Talk to you tomorrow.
Do brain games really make me smarter? What is all this screen time doing to my brain? How do I protect my brain as I age? Find the answers to life's most and least pressing questions about your mind with the Two Guys on Your Head podcast. Check it out wherever you get your podcasts.